Have you ever wondered how an apparently ordinary teenager can come to commit an extreme crime? JamieMiller was not born a villain, but his story shows how isolation, frustration, and online influences can create fertile ground for devastating decisions. It is paradoxical. In search of belonging, he distances himself from reality. In search of validation, he finds reinforcement for hatred. In this video, we will dive into the layers that shaped his choices and understand what happens when mind, society, and technology collide in a dangerous way. Get ready, because Jamie's story will make you question the digital world around you and how it can influence vulnerable minds. If you are a fan of cinema, psychology, and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel now so you do not miss any video. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Leave your answer in the comments. JamieMiller is a teenager who, at first glance, seems ordinary. But when you look more closely, you notice a complexity that goes beyond appearance. He lives in a world full of expectations, social pressure, and that constant feeling of not fitting in. From an early age, Jamie feels he needs to prove something to others, even without knowing exactly what. This search for acceptance shapes his choices, small gestures, and even his most intimate thoughts. His school life is marked by ups and downs. He navigates friendships that are not always genuine and faces classmates who do not hesitate to judge him. Each comment, each look, leaves invisible marks that accumulate over time. It is as if the world is always testing his patience and self-esteem. Jamie learns to hide his vulnerabilities, creating a facade that, for many, seems natural. At home, Jamie faces his own silent battles. The family, although present, does not always perceive the subtle signs of suffering. Sometimes he feels isolated, even in a safe space, as if no one really understands him. This feeling of misunderstanding feeds an internal emptiness that he tries to fill with external validation. Small defeats of everyday life gain larger proportions in his mind. Jamie's interest in technology and the internet becomes an escape. Social networks, forums, and online communities offer a space where he can express himself without immediate fear of judgment. It is there that he finds people with similar thoughts and frustrations, creating a sense of belonging that is missing in the real world. But at the same time, these connections can reinforce negative and extreme thought patterns. Jamie is also curious and observant. He notices nuances in people's behavior and begins to form theories about society, relationships, and power. Sometimes his mind works like a radar, picking up injustices or situations that others ignore. This sharp perception, although valuable, also leaves him vulnerable to distorted interpretations of reality. He begins to question intentions and morality of everything around him. Despite his intelligence, Jamie struggles with deep feelings of inadequacy. He constantly compares himself to others, feeling that he is always behind some impossible standard. This silent self-criticism turns into frustration, anger, and a sense of helplessness. Each small rejection becomes an internal narrative that reinforces his isolation and resentment. An important aspect is that Jamie is sensitive to external influence. Conversations with classmates, videos, and online content shape his worldview. He absorbs information without critical filtering and often interprets messages in an extreme way. This continuous exposure contributes to reinforcing his distorted beliefs and justifying feelings of injustice or hostility. Finally, Jamie is a character who shows us how vulnerability, isolation, and digital influence can combine to create dangerous ground. His story is not one of simple adolescent rebellion, but of a young man seeking meaning and belonging, even for the wrong reasons. This setup prepares us to understand the deeper conflicts he will face in the narrative, and how these internal layers will be decisive for what comes next. JamieMiller now finds himself at the epicenter of a conflict that no one could have imagined. The accusation against him is not just a legal record, but a reflection of what happens when internal frustrations and wrong choices collide with reality. The judicial process exposes not only his acts, but also his motivations, his story, and the influence of external factors that shaped his mind. Each hearing, each testimony, acts as a mirror showing the complexity that led to the crime. He quickly realizes that justice is not just a matter of right or wrong, but of interpretation and consequence. Every word spoken against him carries weight and moral judgment, making it clear that society demands responsibility. It is a brutal shock for a teenager who, for a long time, felt invisible and misunderstood. The courtroom becomes the stage of a painful reflection on his actions and choices. The legal conflict also reveals the tension between reality and perception. Jamie faces the accusation of a serious crime, but must deal with the way his actions were seen by others. The feeling of personal injustice mixes with the weight of the law, creating an emotional whirlwind. He begins to understand that intentions and interpretations do not always align, and that responsibility does not depend on intention but on impact. Within the process, social pressure is almost tangible. The media and the public follow every step, forming opinions even before any verdict. For Jamie, this increases isolation and anxiety. He feels watched, judged, and exposed, with no room to explain himself. This constant surveillance intensifies feelings of anger and helplessness that were already present. The accusation also forces Jamie to confront his own decisions. He realizes how small gestures and internalized thoughts accumulated until culminating in the crime. The court, therefore, is not just a place of punishment, but of forced reflection, where he is confronted with the consequence of every action. It is a painful mirror of his own trajectory of frustration and isolation. The young man also deals with the impact of being compared to stereotypes and labels. He is interpreted as someone who represents a bigger problem in society, which further increases the feeling of being misunderstood. This pressure to be a symbol of something negative adds enormous psychological weight, showing how collective judgments can influence individual perception of guilt. The judicial process also highlights the vulnerability of teenagers facing complex systems. Jamie, with his whole history and context, faces laws and procedures that require clarity, rationality, and emotional control, things he is still learning to develop. This gap between emotional maturity and social expectation becomes fertile ground for intense internal conflicts. At the end of this conflict, although the court has not finished, it is already clear how factors such as isolation, frustration, and exposure to external pressures led him to extreme situations. Jamie faces not just a formal accusation, but the impact of his choices in real life. This moment sets the stage for understanding how external influences, such as online groups and communities, shaped his behavior in a crucial way. JamieMiller spends most of his time online, immersed in communities that promise understanding and belonging. These platforms serve as a refuge, a space where he feels he finally fits in. But this feeling of acceptance comes with an invisible risk. Extreme ideas and toxic discourse become normal, almost imperceptibly. He absorbs this content without realizing he is being shaped by distorted opinions that reinforce his frustration. Within these communities, Jamie finds people who share frustrations, anger, and resentment. Comments and posts validate his darkest thoughts, creating a kind of continuous echo. What starts as a venting space turns into reinforcement of dangerous ideas. He learns, without realizing it, that the group does not judge, but also does not correct. It only amplifies negative feelings. Online interactions offer a false sense of control. Jamie can choose who to communicate with, what content to absorb, and even create parallel identities. But this freedom comes at a price. The critical filter weakens, and extreme opinions start to seem normal. He begins to internalize a distorted view of reality, where hostility and resentment are justifiable. In these communities, the line between information and radicalization becomes thin. Discussions that seemed innocent take on contours of militancy and moral judgment. Jamie realizes that the group values courage, but in a distorted way, where attacking others is seen as self-defense. He begins to believe that his most negative feelings are shared and even admired, creating a dangerous sense of belonging. The social media algorithm also comes into play, amplifying thought patterns. Jamie is continuously exposed to content that reinforces his frustrations and loneliness. Each click and interaction further directs his attention to groups that reinforce hatred, alienation, and resentment. Without realizing it, he is being shaped by a digital narrative that validates anger and hostility as natural responses. The dynamics of these groups also create silent competition among members. Jamie observes who is more courageous or engaged, measuring his own identity through others' behavior. This constant comparison reinforces existing insecurities and frustrations, turning digital experiences into real emotional triggers. He begins to believe he must match toxic standards to be accepted. Even when Jamie seeks moments of reflection, collective influence overrides. He learns strategies of justification, rationalization, and even emotional self-protection, but all within a distorted context. The perception of right and wrong becomes blurred, and every online step builds an invisible foundation for decisions he would never have made alone. In the end, online groups and communities are not just social spaces, they are molds that direct thoughts and attitudes. For Jamie, these spaces act as fertile ground for accumulated frustration, anger, and resentment. The online experience begins to shape not only his ideas, but also his actions, paving the way for the conflicts and extreme behaviors that will follow. Within the online universe that Jamie frequents, he ends up encountering misogynistic ideologies and incel communities. These spaces reinforce the idea that the world is against him, especially regarding women, creating a distorted narrative of victim and aggressor. He begins to see relationships and social interactions as battlefields where rejection and frustration become justifications for resentment. It is a self-perpetuating cycle, feeding hatred masked as logic. The language used in these groups is loaded with terms and concepts that normalize hostility. Jamie absorbs these expressions without realizing it, as if they were tools to interpret reality. Each conversation reinforces the idea that his frustration is not only legitimate but also shared and even valued by the collective. This distorted validation makes feelings of anger and injustice solidify even more in his mind. These communities teach strategies of emotional rationalization. Jamie learns to justify hatred, frustration, and resentment as natural responses to his experiences. Rejections, small failures, or criticisms become proof that he is right to feel wronged. Misogyny ceases to be an abstract theme and becomes a lens through which he interprets all interactions with the opposite sex. The idea of belonging is powerful. Jamie feels that he has found a space where his frustrations are understood and even admired. This creates a sense of emotional loyalty that is difficult to break. With each discussion, he gets closer to the group's mentality, internalizing views that outside that space would be extreme and unacceptable. The effect is silent, almost imperceptible, yet profound. The psychological impact is direct. Jamie begins to see women and relationships as obstacles rather than complex human experiences. He interprets neutral interactions as rejection and hostility, reinforcing a narrative of helplessness and anger. This emotional distortion creates fertile ground for extreme thoughts and behaviors, where blame is always transferred to the other. Internalized misogyny and incel thinking become lenses through which Jamie justifies negative feelings. He learns to blame collectively, seeing society and women as adversaries. Every rejection or frustration fits into this narrative, reinforcing the idea that his anger and resentment are natural responses to systemic injustice. Even small external stimuli are interpreted by Jamie through this filter. Comments from classmates, casual conversations, or even trivial situations are seen as confirmations that he is right. This constant validation within the group intensifies hostility and reduces the capacity for empathy or critical reflection. Reality becomes only what confirms his narrative. In the end, the combination of misogyny and incel influence not only shapes thoughts but also paves the way for extreme actions. Jamie is not just immersed in ideas, he is slowly guided by them, and each subsequent decision begins to be influenced by this distorted worldview. This prepares us to understand how these factors directly contributed to the crime he committed. JamieMiller, by combining isolation, frustration, and digital influence, reaches a critical point. Each small resentment, each feeling of injustice, accumulated in visible layers that became the driving force for his actions. It is not a simple matter of choice, but of a mind shaped by environments that reinforce anger, helplessness, and distortion of reality. He begins to believe that there is only one way to deal with all of this. Online communities gave him validation, but also shaped a dangerous thought pattern. Jamie began to see each frustration as a personal attack and each rejection as reason for retaliation. The internalized hatred strengthened with each interaction, making his emotions more intense and less controllable. The line between indignation and extreme action began to blur. Misogyny and incel thinking acted as catalysts. Jamie learned to blame externally, transferring his frustration to targets that became symbolic of what he felt was injustice. Each absorbed toxic narrative gave meaning to his resentment and gradually built internal justifications for attitudes that, outside that context, would have been unthinkable. Emotional isolation also contributed significantly. Without trusted people to hear or question his thoughts, Jamie became increasingly vulnerable to distorted interpretations of reality. He did not receive counterbalances that could have prevented the escalation of hostility. Internal emptiness and the accumulated sense of injustice began to dictate behavior. The judicial process, social pressure, and constant judgment further reinforced this cycle. Jamie felt cornered, exposed, and misunderstood, which intensified his sense of hopelessness. He began to see the extreme act as a way to assert control or at least respond to the world he believed was against him. The legal context did not correct, but only amplified already intense emotions. Each factor intertwined: isolation, digital validation, toxic communities, misogyny, and the sense of injustice. What was common adolescent frustration became fertile ground for drastic decisions. Jamie did not act impulsively without reason. He acted within a highly shaped and influenced psychological context. The narrative of the crime is thus a predictable consequence of this set of forces. Even after the act, the echoes of these factors continue to influence his mind. The sense of belonging in extreme communities, the internal justification of resentment, and the distorted perception of reality do not disappear easily. Jamie remains a living reflection of how psychological and social environments can push someone to extreme limits. In the end, Jamie Miller's story is not about defense or excuse. It is about understanding complex mental processes. Each element he experienced contributed to the tragedy. By analyzing step by step how isolation, online communities, and toxic ideologies converge, we can understand, without justifying, the mechanisms that led to the crime, preparing the viewer to reflect on prevention and social perception. And so, after understanding the entire trajectory of Jamie Miller, what do you think about how isolation, online communities, and toxic ideologies can influence extreme decisions? This is the point that makes us reflect the most. How many times have we or someone close come close to distorted thoughts without realizing it? Tell me in the comments which character you want me to analyze in the next video on the channel. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to continue learning about how the human mind can be shaped and sometimes deceived.